Hello, my name is Vishal, and my partner's name is Harris, who will be appearing later on in this video. And today we're here to do an experiment to prove something. So the purpose of this experiment that we're about to show you is to prove whether plants truly provide oxygen. So some background information that one should know before this experiment is that plants, although we know that plants provide oxygen, it's not a common thing to do to prove that. Also, fire is something that needs oxygen to stay alive, to keep burning. Without oxygen, fire wouldn't burn. For example, if you struck a match in space, it just wouldn't light because there's no oxygen. So the materials that one would need for this experiment to be a success is the following: a container, a plant, a candle, and a few matchsticks. The procedure one should follow for this experiment to be a success are the following. First, obtain all your materials. Second, strike a match and light your candle. Place it in your container and seal the container. Make sure there's nothing else in the container. And then time for how long the candle stays lit. Step 3, take out your candle, place your plant inside the container, light your candle again, and place it in the container with the plant. Seal your container, making sure no air goes in, and time for how long the candle stays lit. So the experimental question that we're trying to answer here is: do plants truly release oxygen? Do plants truly provide O2? So there's a control in this experiment. A control meaning something that the experiment depends on, something that the experiment needs, or else this experiment will be completely pointless to do. And that is the lid of the container. Without the lid, this experiment would be completely pointless. There would be no point in doing it. So the hypothesis that I'm going to state before we start this experiment is if a burning candle is placed inside a container along with the plant, then it will stay lit for a longer period of time than if one put the burning candle inside the container all alone, because the plant provides oxygen for the candle to stay lit. So before we show you our experiments, I would like to show you the materials that we use, just to give you a visual reference. So here's the container that we use, and this is a plastic container, but ideally this experiment would be done with a glass jar. Unfortunately, I cannot obtain a glass jar for 2 reasons. First reason is, well, I cannot find a glass jar. Second reason is I cannot find a glass jar big enough. And the reason why we needed a container big enough is to fit a plant big enough. And the reason why we needed a plant big enough is something I'll explain in just 2 minutes. So this is the container, and you can see here that I sealed the small holes that were in the lid, and the reason is because so no oxygen would come into the container, no excess oxygen would come except from what was provided by the plant. And the reason is because if oxygen came in, there would be no point in having a plant. So those cracks need to be sealed. So if you do use a plastic container, make sure all cracks and holes are sealed. So that's the container. Now you see here is our plant. Anyone can use any sort of plant. I hope they all provide oxygen. So this is the plant that we use, and now I'll explain why it's fairly large. The reason why we use a plant fairly large is because I realized we needed a plant fairly large to provide enough oxygen. The larger the plant, the more oxygen it will provide. And the reason why we need more oxygen is so enough oxygen is provided for the candle. I realized, what if we used a small plant and the candle needed more oxygen to burn than what the plant provided? Then this experiment would be a flaw. There would be a failure in the experiment. So that's why we used a fairly large plant. Now, here's the tape that we used just to seal the container. Not one of the major materials, but that's there. And here's our candle. It's sealed in a small, tiny jar. It doesn't make a difference in the experiment at all, actually. It just holds the candle, so that's the candle. And we also needed a timer, so I used my phone for the timer, just to time for how long the candle stayed lit. Okay, so now we will show you our experiment. The first one is when we put the candle inside the jar all by itself. The second one is when we put it along with the plant. And what you'll notice, you probably did notice this already, that this video is fairly long, and the reason is because our videos of the experiment are fairly long. When we put the candle in all by itself, the candle stayed lit for 9 minutes and 50 seconds. That's a fairly long time. And when we put it in with the plant, it stayed on for even longer, 13 minutes. That's even longer. That's really long. That's why this video is fairly long. So if you want, you can skip ahead. But before we show your experiment, I would like to just explain why it may have been that long. So you notice that this container is fairly large. The fire needs to take in all the oxygen that's already inside the container and burn that, turn it into CO2. So that's why the candle stayed lit for a fairly long time. All that oxygen inside still needs to get used up. So that's why it's long. And what makes it even longer is that the plant's providing even more oxygen at the same time when it's inside the container. So it's the container's oxygen and the plant's oxygen that's being used up. So it makes it even longer. So that's why these videos are fairly long. You can skip ahead if you want, but now we will show you our first experiment when we put in the candle inside the container all alone. Alright, so when we placed it inside the container, if you didn't notice, it stayed lit for approximately 9 minutes and 50 seconds. That was with the can of Apollo. Now here's what we noticed when we placed it along with the plant. So, if you didn't time it, well, we did, and we noticed that the candle stayed lit for almost 13 minutes. That's pretty much 3 minutes longer than what the candle stayed lit for without the plant, and that's a significant time buffer. And now Harris will explain why it's so important.
My name is Harris, and my part of this lab is to provide an explanation of what was going on in the experiment, and also to provide proof that plants do, however, give off oxygen. Before I start, I would like to give a brief overview of the experiment. When Vishwa lit the candle on fire and placed it inside the jar, the fire on top of the candle only lasted for a few seconds or minutes. However, in contrast, when the lit candle was placed beside a plant and a jar was put over, the fire on the candle lasted way more than the candle alone in the jar. First off, I'm going to start with jar 1, which is the candle alone in the jar. Before we get started, there is background information of the fire that is essential in this experiment. There is an equation of fire, and it is heat plus oxygen plus fuel, which is the candle itself. These three combined will give you fire, or will start a fire. However, the absence of any one of these components will not start a fire or keep a fire going. So keeping this in mind, I will give you a visual. So this is a visual representation of the experiment of jar 1, which is the candle alone inside the jar. What I have over here is the legend and the two main types of gases that were essential in this experiment. The first one is oxygen, which I have represented by a blue circle. The second one is carbon dioxide, in which I have represented it by a red circle. I also have the equation of fire, which is oxygen plus heat plus fuel is equal to fire. And as we know, the absence of any one of these components will not start a fire or keep a fire going. So getting started, what I have in the jar are the main types of gases present inside the jar, and they are carbon dioxide and oxygen. And as we know, for a candle there is a fire on top of it, and fire requires oxygen. So what fire does is that it starts to deplete its limited supply of oxygen slowly and over time. As time passes, the amount of oxygen in the jar starts to deplete because the fire is taking up all the oxygen. As we know, that when fire burns any organic material, it releases carbon dioxide. And so what is now filling up in the jar is carbon dioxide. But according to the equation of fire, we need oxygen, heat, and fuel. So as we look back to the equation of fire, we do have heat, which is the energy surrounding the fire. We also have our fuel, which is the candle itself. However, we do not have oxygen because the fire took up all its oxygen supply, and oxygen surrounding the jar from the outside cannot penetrate because the jar is sealed. As a result, the fire goes out. And this is because we know that the absence of any one of these components will not start a fire or keep a fire going, and that is what exactly happened over here. The fire depleted its supply of oxygen in the jar, and since it was missing one of the components, it was not able to keep it going. So now that you have seen the visual explanation of jar 1, you now know why the candle in jar 1 only lasted for a few minutes. Now I am going to show a visual explanation of the candle in jar 2 and explain why it lasted longer than the candle in jar 1. So what I have here is a visual of jar 2, which is the lit candle and the plant inside a sealed jar. What I have over here is the legend of the two main types of gases that are present inside the jar. What I also have over here is the equation of fire, which is oxygen plus heat plus fuel. So starting off with fire first, part of our equation states that fire needs oxygen, heat, and fuel. We do have the heat, which is the energy surrounding the fire. We do also have our fuel, which is the candle itself. And what it also needs is oxygen. So as the candle starts to consume is its supply of oxygen, the oxygen levels inside the jar starts to drop, and eventually there is no more oxygen in our diagram. However, when we look back into our experiment, we saw that the candle still keeps on going. So as we look back to our equation, we do have our heat, which is the energy surrounding the fire. We also do have our fuel, which is the candle. However, we do not see any oxygen. So there must be a source of oxygen coming somewhere inside the jar, since the jar is sealed. So what we can conclude now is that the plant is giving off oxygen, since there is no other way for oxygen to penetrate through the jar. And as we know, through the process of photosynthesis, as the plant consumes carbon dioxide, it releases oxygen back into the jar. And as we know, for fire, the fire consumes the oxygen inside the jar and releases carbon dioxide, which is beneficial for the plant. This cycle goes on as long as there is fuel and these components are available. So what we can conclude now is that the plants do give off oxygen, and that is because there is no other source of oxygen inside the jar, because oxygen outside the jar cannot penetrate since the jar is sealed, and as a result the photosynthesis is correct, and we can conclude that plants do, however, give off oxygen. In conclusion, we now know that plants do, however, give off oxygen based on our observation and explanation. When the lit candle alone was placed inside the sealed jar, the fire on top of the candle only lasted for a few minutes. However, in contrast, when the lit candle and the plant was placed inside the jar, the fire on top of the candle lasted longer than the fire on top of the candle alone in jar 1. After doing this experiment, new questions arise, and they are: does the plant species differ the oxygen level given off? And does the absence of sunlight affect the oxygen given off from plants? Thank you for listening to our presentation.